Thank you, Mohammed. Yeah, so like you said, I'm a teacher trainer, materials designer, item writer as well. And nowadays I'm really focusing on working with teachers who want to become better at teaching skills as opposed to just testing them. That is especially the case if, let me just check my view for a second. That is especially the case if teachers are already teaching exams or are planning to get into exams teaching and teaching for IELTS in particular. And in preparation for this talk today, and following the hype on social media around ChatGPT, I typed in the phrase, why should we teach soft skills when preparing learners for IELTS yesterday? And I got back the following answer, and I would like you to think carefully what is kind of problematic with this answer, because much as we believe that AI is super powerful and is definitely here to stay, and that's a whole other conversation, what we want to do about it and how we adapt as teachers and as learners. This answer wasn't satisfactory to me. So I'm looking to read your answers, why you think it is also problematic. So I got back the answer that teaching soft skills when preparing learners for IELTS is important for several reasons. Number one, by focusing on soft skills such as pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar, learners can improve their accuracy in each task type, resulting in a higher band score. Any ideas as to why this is a problematic answer to the question? Why should we teach soft skills when we work with IELTS students? So I repeat the answer. Teaching soft skills when preparing learners for IELTS is important for several reasons. Number one, because by focusing on soft skills such as pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary, learners can improve their accuracy in each task type, resulting in a higher overall band score. Do you notice anything in this answer that's not quite right? You can also unmute and just, again, please, yeah, I'll read it out slower as well. So the answer is, teaching soft skills when preparing learners for IELTS is important for several reasons. Number one, by focusing on soft skills such as pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar, learners can improve their accuracy in each task type. Did you notice anything that's kind of contradictory in the answer here, or is it time for me to reveal the fact that even AI thinks that grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation are skills, which they absolutely are not. They are what we would call the language systems of any language for that matter, not just English. So if you're learning a foreign language, be it Spanish or German, it's going to have its systems, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, and what we call discourse, and it's going to have its 4 macro skills. So of course, we will want to help our learners improve their listening, reading, writing, and speaking skills as well. So yeah, this says a lot about our awareness of not just of what skills teaching is in general, but what soft skills teaching is as well, because that's even more obvious to most teachers that I work with. And it's understandable because it's really a tricky concept. So, you know, before we dive into talking at length, let's just examine what is a good strategy, a good general strategy to raise soft skill awareness when we are working with learners. So it's usually a good idea to start a lesson by choosing a microprocess, something that a fluent or a proficient user of that language, native or otherwise, would use, and try to isolate it from the bigger skills. So, for example, if you're teaching writing, we don't want to teach how to write an essay in just one lesson. That would be a bit too ambitious, but it's probably a better strategy, especially if we're teaching classes of 200 students. But even smaller, if they're new to IELTS, if they're new to academic writing, we will just want to focus on one strategy and one component of the whole skill for example, how to write an effective introductory paragraph, or how to write a good thesis statement, or just to learn what a thesis statement is at all, and how it will have to be kind of connected to what is in the task. So you see, these are more microscopic segments of the bigger macro skill. And we as teachers, if we want to be good skills teachers, have to really become conscious of these. And we'll have to also practice pulling these apart. Because yes, when a proficient writer or a proficient, in this case, let's stay with the writing example. So if a proficient writer in English, uses 40 minutes and writes a wonderful essay, a lot of micro strategies will, be in place for that to happen. One of which is that they will likely be very aware of what a good thesis statement should look like. They will also be very aware of paragraphing as a concept, and how important it is to organize our thoughts into separate paragraphs, just in terms of layout, but in terms of, kind of content organization as well. What we mean by a paragraph, and how each paragraph should be distinct and relevant to the bigger topic, and yet separate enough to be saying new things at the same time. So these are the micro components of the bigger skill of writing, and academic writing in particular. So we need to be really conscious of these and create actionable steps in advance and write these into our lesson plan, to scaffold it sufficiently, much more than it usually is done in my experience, unfortunately, because students might fall through the cracks. So they might not know where to start. If we tell them, okay, you have 40 minutes, please write an essay, here's the task. I think that's a bit too challenging, potentially a bit too demoralizing as well. So we really do want to break it down into smaller sub-skills, and just focus on one sub-skill, and even go more granular and plan separate exercises around each, and make sure that we have feedback, as Annie was also alluding to the importance of feedback, to have feedback up after each micro stage and after each exercise. Because what I often see happen is that learners finish an exercise, and theoretically we've had feedback on that stage, but they are not quite clear. They haven't kind of formulated their own conclusions as to what just happened, or what, in that exercise is important, or how it's going to help them write a better introduction to an essay, for example. So actionable steps, thorough feedback, and taking the learner through these steps. And what we are aiming for is to really raise their awareness of each step and of each kind of strategy as we go along, because we want them to be able to consciously repeat what they have done with us alone as well in another situation, including under exam stress, which, as we know, is especially challenging. So this is what I mean by soft skills. And I know this is quite new on its own, right? So if you had any questions, let me just check the comments as well before we continue. Yeah, I see Eunice saying that just about GPT, sorry. Without the basics, can they do the soft skills? Very good question, Surani. Some soft skills they can. So I see where this question is coming from, as in, if we don't have enough systems knowledge, if a learner who is on A2 level in the Common European Framework Reference, or really lower level, they will simply not have enough grammatical and lexical knowledge to be able to execute certain skills. And I agree with you that to some extent it is true that we need some building blocks to the language, but then again, we as teachers tend to kind of get away with not teaching skills, even later on higher levels, because we are still assuming that they couldn't cope with it, or it's kind of still hard. So often we are just disguising our own lack of confidence around skills teaching, in my experience. So I would say, start thinking about what skills are even on lower levels. Start checking how you can scaffold the material and how you can make things even more and more granular for your learners than it already is in the course book for the most part. Yes, I see some comments about academic writing still. So other than a lack of awareness of how skills and systems are different, there is also a lack of awareness of what sub-skills are. These were two skills and two issues that I see that contribute to this confusion. Not so much confusion, but just the fact that, you know, teaching grammar and vocabulary is more common and is less challenging. And I have another 6 listed here. So let's go through them. And again, if you have any questions or comments, I'm reading them as well. The next one is that teaching systems, so grammar and vocabulary, is often more tangible. It's simply much easier. And therefore, it's more measurable on initial teacher training courses as well. So if you've taken the Cambridge CELTA or equivalent, or the CERT TESOL or any other entry-level teacher training course, you are familiar with how the bigger focus is on systems teaching, for the same reason that these are the building blocks of any language, and they are more measurable. So it's much easier to plan a grammar lesson around, let's say, can, used for polite requests on A2 level, to stay with this lower level, because then we know that all we'll have to do, you know, to pass the lesson is to examine the target language in action to see how it behaves in the declarative, in the negative, and in the yes, no, or WH question form, how it behaves in context. We just expose them to some material that has enough examples of the target language, whether it's their course book or whether we write some materials for this purpose. And that's a successful lesson for the most part, if you included enough practice and if you didn't run out of time. So there are other things you have to be mindful of. And this is all more measurable, more tangible. So when a trainer or a director of studies checks those stages in the lesson plan, it's kind of easier to see whether those stages happened. Similarly, if you're teaching vocabulary, we will typically pick 5, 6, 7 items for our target language for that lesson. Usually it's grouped around a topic that usually is in our course book, so it's usually not our decision at all. And yeah, it will be, for example, if you're teaching holiday vocabulary, it will be words like, or words and phrases and expressions such as go to the beach, sandcastle, suntan lotion, to get sunburned, and if you've exposed your learners to these expressions, and if they then, towards the second half of the lesson, if they got to use them and there is evidence that they use these, then that's a job well done. That's a very good systems lesson. That's a really good vocabulary lesson in particular. So it's somehow easier to notice whether these criteria were met, in my experience. And probably partly because of this, teaching systems and grammar and vocabulary in particular is more emphasized in course books as well. So you will see that course books tend to test the skills. So they're really focused on outcome, and they really have this tendency to just check whether the students got the right or wrong answer, and to really focus on comprehension in the case of the receptive skills, so reading and listening, and production in the case of speaking and writing, so the productive skills, which is very binary, very black and white. So just checking whether they got it right and then give them the demoralizing feedback that no, they probably didn't, is not really scaffolded and careful enough teaching, in my experience. But it happens, and it's not to kind of scold entry-level teacher training qualifications, because they're really important. They really help us become more confident about going into a classroom and running systems and skills lessons, quite scripted ones, but running them confidently. So that in the case of the receptive skills, it will look like us raising the interest in the topic, usually using some pictures or visuals, and then pre-teaching any blocking vocabulary, which I'm really especially against, but that's a whole other conversation. especially against when it comes to preparing learners for the IELTS exam in particular. Then when we have done that, we set a GIST task, and then learners read or listen for the first time, and to just get a global understanding of what the recording or what the text is about. Then we set a listen or read for detail task. They go listen and read for the second time, and then we give them feedback on the answers, and we tell them, no, number one was A and you chose B, so tough luck. And then there is some sort of a follow-up stage, which is often either further language work, connected to maybe a previous lessons, or not even the lesson at hand, or it might be a skill task, but it's often a freer practice of another skill. So if you've run if you've tried to teach a listening lesson, and then at the very end there is a follow-up stage where learners have to talk about holidays, or to connect it to the theme of the lesson, then we can't really say that that you're still teaching skill at that point in the lesson, at least not the one that you were probably hoping to teach. Course books also really like to use the skills just as carrier for again, systems work. So to present and to practice grammar and vocabulary, and that's really unfair. So I'm here to kind of raise our own awareness of how skills matter as well, but also to just push back on how skills deserve a bit more attention, and they would really be better served if we actually taught them, and if we actually practiced them on their own right, and not just as carriers of another thing, grammar or vocabulary for the most part. So I'm just going to check the questions if there is any, just general feedback. Talking about feedback on the conference, very well. Yeah, so teaching systems is more tangible. It's emphasized by course books. And yeah, like Eunice is saying, very much prescribed by your course book often. So that's something to push back against, or to try to scaffold and to upgrade your course book, which we'll talk about in a second. And often another reason is that teaching systems is kind of expected in a lot of teaching contexts and cultural contexts, because grammar and vocabulary is what we traditionally understand by teaching a language. And this will, depend on, again, local culture and context. But in a lot of teaching contexts that I have had the experience of working in the world, I came across local sacred cows, so local favorite ideas in key stakeholders' minds. So that is school directors of studies, parents, teachers, local colleagues, the students themselves, especially if they're teenagers or adults, concerning what good teaching should look like, what it should feel like. And it's sometimes really challenging to push back against these, and sometimes they are really heavily grammar and vocab focused again. So in a local context where I worked for a couple of years, for example, I had to organize, as a director for school, I had to organize spelling bees very frequently, which is, of course, vocabulary, so systems knowledge, and it's not in any way related to skill practice, in my experience, not the way how we had to run these, because this is what the parents expected. Because learners were just told to learn a set of words by heart, and they would have to then spell them out right. So our hands were to some extent tied by the context, is all I'm saying. And it doesn't mean that we have to give up, but it's something to bear in mind and to try to kind of educate our context as well, if we can. Teaching skills is also often confused with testing, or as I like to call it, testing and scolding, which is analyzing post hoc. So if we have done a full listening, if we have kind of run a whole recording, or God forbid, a whole listening past paper, And then we just tell our learners what the answers were, and even if we expose them to the audio script, and then we analyze one by one, and we kind of check what went wrong. It's not really true that we are teaching. We are still just testing the skill, because we are still, remember, focusing on outcome, and we are very fixated on, did you get number 15 right? Did you choose A or B, or did you write the correct word, not another one, depending on the question type on IELTS as well. And that's a problem, because other than the fact that it can demoralize learners, it's not really a guarantee ever that just because they did the listening and they or the reading, and then they got the answers wrong, and now they understand why the answer was wrong. It's still a major step from there for the learner to reconstruct and to reverse engineer how they are going to behave differently in the next reading that they do, or on the exam, under exam conditions. So I think this is still not similar enough, or it's still not helping them experience successfully executing on that sub-skill. If we don't kind of scaffold it a bit, and if we don't plan it consciously in advance for them. So yeah, some of the learners, the more talented ones, might be able to do this reverse engineering, as I like to call it. So they might be able to kind of draw the conclusions for themselves, and they will try to implement and practice next Thursday, during their next English lesson, which is a week away from today. Who knows if they will remember those personalized conclusions they secretly drew for themselves. So we want to do better than this. We really want to more explicitly help them by focusing on soft skills. Another reason is that teaching skills is quite limited. So for example, it's limited to, when we talk about reading, I'm curious, actually, can you drop in the chat if you can recall one or two reading sub skills that immediately come to mind? Yeah, I'm also reading. Gist and detail, exactly. Scanning, yeah, this is exactly what I knew you would say. And they are skimming and scanning. So reading for gist, reading for specific information, more detailed information, are the two key sub skills that are mentioned on most entry-level courses as well. And they're really, really super important. So yes, proficient readers in a language do use these skills, but there is so much more to reading as well that we don't talk about. Entry-level courses don't talk about, course books don't really talk much about, and definitely don't demonstrate. So if skills are dealt with at all on their own right, not just as carriers for systems teaching, so grammar and vocabulary, they will be quite limited to the usual suspects, skimming and scanning and other, and they will not really go into enough detail, and they will not break down the stages of a lesson thoroughly enough for us to kind of come away with a better understanding, and to come away inspired and try to write a lesson, another sub-skill lesson, using or focusing on another sub-skill in the future. So yeah, these are some of the key ideas. And just to recap, before we talk more about your questions, if you had any, some of the things that we can do, because this is often a question, what can we do about this state of affairs, is to start paying more conscious attention to your course book, to your context, and your own lesson planning preferences or practices, and to start experimenting with scaffolding a lesson, especially if it's a skills lesson, and especially if you're following a course book because of contextual reasons that you're noticing is not dealing with skills deeply enough and thoroughly enough. You can still save that material by writing one or two extra exercises and squeezing them in between the bigger stages of reading for gist, reading for detailed information, feedback, everybody go home. So that's the usual running order in the course book, but you can check the material, see if it lends itself to any sub-skill more than to another, and try to write some exercises in between those main stages. And you can also seek out expert teacher training feedback in your context. If you have somebody with a higher level qualification than just an entry-level certificate, could be a good option, especially if they are confident about teaching skills. And of course, doing a course of some sort, either the Cambridge Delta, especially Module 2, or if you want to start out by a smaller investment, you can check out my courses as well that are coming soon. One is already up on my website on fatimelosonci.com, to kind of learn more about teaching listening, teaching reading, writing, and speaking in particular for IELTS purposes and with IELTS learners. So I'm looking at any previous questions, if you had any. Visualizing, connecting. Connecting is an interesting one. I wonder what you mean by that, Vaskiran. Presenting vocabulary is, you see, that's I don't know what I was talking about when you dropped it in the chat, Sarah, but that's still a systems lesson. That's still a vocab lesson, and yes, listening recordings and reading texts are very much used for that purpose, and it will give learners some experience of reading as an activity and listening as an activity, but it's not actually teaching those skills per se, because actually teaching them would mean focusing on one sub-skill at a time. Inferring, evaluating the author's comments or the author's point of view is a very important sub-skill. Eunice, I agree with you for IELTS as well. Scaffolding goes with setting the scene, providing notes, asking questions, and giving feedback. Yes, and just making sure, if you could, what you're assigning, if you could break it down into an even smaller activity. So, for example, if you talk about writing, you could assign a whole essay. I don't recommend it unless it's a final mock exam and they are taking the exam in 2 days' time and you're really interested in their current stage, or if it's a diagnostic. So if you're at the very beginning of an IELTS preparation course, for example, these are the two key moments where I would just give them the task, and maybe even set a timer for them, and good luck. But in between, we really do want to do some teaching. So in terms of writing, it would look like I already said, focus on paragraphing, focus on meeting the word count. Some learners will really struggle to write enough. Others will really struggle to not write too much, which is a challenge as well. So then we can focus on what I call the word count skeleton method, for example, where they focus on, and they plan in advance, depending on the task, how many words they want to use in each paragraph, which sounds very artificial, but it's a scaffold. It kind of gives them this temporary solution to this problem. Then they get carried away and they either write too much within the paragraph already, which we do want to stop soon enough, and we want to help them get out of this habit, as opposed to writing the whole essay and then realizing that the whole thing is overlong, and then realizing that you have 5 minutes to edit the whole thing. That's often a bit too little, too late by that point. So it's better to just catch it in the, nip it in the bud and focus on how we can help them write a shorter paragraph if their problem is that they write too much overall. That's just one example of scaffolding. Connecting means that learners should think about what they already know about the text. Yes, they should find ways to relate what they study to themselves or the world around them. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's a very useful skill. That's a very useful top-down activation, and activating their background knowledge of the real world, and that's very important for the receptive skills. I agree with you. Yeah, I just call it activating schemata or activating your background knowledge or other. I haven't heard the word connecting yet, but it exists, it's important, and I agree with you. It kind of describes the same activity. Are there any other questions?
We're still looking at the chat box for more questions. So the last comment was about questioning scaffolding. And yeah, thanks indeed for such a thought-provoking contribution. All of your talks, are the same. They are all thought-provoking. They are all, yeah, indeed, yeah, because this is not the first one for us. We had a webinar before talking about something related to that, about the importance of teaching skills, not testing them, right? Yeah, so we have some valuable comments here in the chat box. Someone was saying the problem, yeah, sorry to say this, but teachers in most teaching contexts teach to the test. They teach to the test. This is a very big problem because, they only care about having the students get the full marks and share the posts on social media talking about how good the teachers were and so on. But the most important thing is the language the students are developing to use in the outside world, not only in the exams. I think this point, most teachers choose to neglect this fact that working on the language itself, the language development, is much more more important than teaching for the test, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was just going to say that I actually don't think it's a tragedy, because depending on the test we choose, and if we think it's a valid test overall for our purposes, and that's a whole other conversation. There is quite a lot of debate around IELTS, whether it's really a valid, how good a product it is for pre-sessional, pre-EAP purposes. Is it enough? Is it not enough? Opinions will vary. My opinion is that it's an amazing bridging tool or a bridging opportunity of a test, in the sense that, yes, it's true that it's not teaching integrated skills like university students will have to use during their studies at university, on a master's or on a PhD program. So IELTS can't possibly recreate those conditions where they read 3 books, 4 books, and then they write a 2,500 long essay referenced with proper referencing skills, which is another skill that IELTS is not testing, of course, because the essay of 250 words that IELTS requires is based on the learner's own ideas for the most part, and therefore the topics are quite generic. And yet it does give us an idea of the sub-skills in place or not with a particular learner. So can they produce an organized, relatively coherent and cohesive academic-looking essay in 40 minutes, or can't they? It's a good predictor of how much they will struggle once they start to study biology, chemistry, law, you name it, engineering, so all those other subjects. Because remember, a lot of these students are not planning to do an MA in English necessarily, English language teaching or other. So they really are just trying to figure out the basics of academic writing, for example. And IELTS is a good product to meet that need. So I'm not so sad that we are teaching to the test, if the test is IELTS, is my comment on that.